Thank you ever so much for coming. I'm going to try and speak for say 45 minutes or so. If anybody really wants to interrupt, that is fine, honestly. The thing I'm most worried about is I stop speaking and none of you ask me any questions. So please have a think. I'm going to largely make the case for equality. You could have a more balanced lecture where somebody stands up and says no and somebody says why, but I find I get schizophrenic if I try and do that. So it's just a warning at the start. This is going to be fairly one-sided about why being a bit more equal is, I think, better, particularly when you're one of the most unequal rich countries in the world. And the kind of thing that upsets me about this debate is that when Bill Gates was interviewed about 2 weeks ago in Davos and he was asked about growing inequality in the world, he just turned to the interviewer and said, well, what do you want, North Korea? As if there was no alternative between North Korea and what the United States has become. My worry is that Bill Gates actually doesn't know that there is an alternative. He's a good computer programmer. He's not actually somebody who knows much about social science. But because he's a very rich man, we often take what he says quite seriously. Just a note about words. I think it's interesting to look back at words and various groups and how we think of them. You may not know about these groups, but you can look up the Levellers and the Diggers, all the Quakers when they were in their heyday, socialists like Robert Owen, who I think he had one of the first playgroups in Britain in the meals he had. He wasn't completely nice, but at least he had a playgroup. Chartists, all feminists, or even the hippies from the 1960s, all the trade unions and what they gave people, how they got people rights, how they got the factory acts so the hours went down, all the Occupy movement. And as you get nearer in time, you begin to go, oh, that's a bit more dodgy, the Occupy movement, they were a bit violent. But as you look back, these are often the kind of groups that we laud for how they improve society. We don't tend to celebrate people being selfish or psychotic or individualistic or greedy. And that's why if we ended up in a world that sees inequality as okay or inevitable, when if we look back at our past and the way we celebrate parts of our past, we don't tend to celebrate people in the past who managed to make us more unequal. Talking of which, this isn't an actual poster. It was one of those sabotage posters before the general election. Many things don't work that well when you become more unequal when you break them up. The United States, I think, spends 16% of its GDP on healthcare. By far the largest amount of money spent on healthcare in the world, the largest proportion, from a very rich country. A lot of that money is public money. Medicare and Medicaid are public spending on healthcare. And what do they get for spending 16% of their annual income on healthcare? They get the lowest life expectancy in the rich world and the highest infant mortality. And I'm going to argue this is because it's a very divided country. A disproportionate amount of that money spent on healthcare in the States is spent on people who are well. It's plastic surgery. It's operations that you don't need but you've got the money for it. And the least money is spent on the people who are most ill, and that's what happens in a very unequal society. We get the NHS very cheaply. It's a cheaper way of providing healthcare even than much of what occurs in the rest of mainland Europe. It might not be brilliant, but it's actually relatively cheap compared to private systems. We're beginning to see dissent rising again. This is my favourite dissent picture. I don't know if that poor man's out of his job now, isn't he? The rather large head of RBS. That's him shown in proportion to his salary. So if you expand his body to make it in proportion to his annual salary, that was the man working on our behalf, because we now own that bank, to keep it running. And there you've got a hospital consultant drawn to scale, and you can go all the way down if you've got good eyesight and see the others. But that kind of poster and the poster before are produced because people are not happy with the kind of things that are going on. It was more subtle in the past. In the bottom left you can see a very famous photo which was published I think in 1937, and it's of the annual Harrow-Eton cricket match. And what's interesting about the photo is that the three working class boys there are looking a bit cheeky, and the two upper class boys are looking a bit nervous. And it was an equivalent picture to what we're more brash about today. It was a sign that things were changing, that society was changing. I first produced these slides for the Royal Statistical Society, so I'm afraid you're going to get quite a few graphs and so on, but I'm going to skip over the detail of a lot of them. The Royal Statistical Society got its first charter from Queen Victoria, and this is what its job was to do. To look at the conditions and the prospects for society and what was happening to people and the moral relations in society. About a couple of decades ago they took that out of their charter, which I thought was a bit sad, but we can look at a whole kind of history of change in Britain and people being concerned about things which are not just about numbers but about how we ought to get on with each other. Here's a picture of probably the most famous economist Britain's ever had, John Maynard Keynes, who helped us get out of the last great financial crash we had. But what his friend, who was a banker, Oswald Falk, said is that what Keynes really did was to codify the moral feelings of the age in the 1920s and particularly 1930s. And I'm going to argue with you in a way that we're back there. If you look at the last big financial crash and the last time we were most unequal, members of the establishment, members of the upper class, joined with many other people to say this isn't right, it's wrong, we need to change the way we are. My favourite example of this is Beveridge, William Beveridge, who was a fairly right-wing eugenicist as a young man. He wrote a book just about 100 years ago about how you ought to treat women to keep them in their place and to produce 4 children for the good of the race. You know which race he meant. By the late 1930s, William Beveridge had had his views changed enough that he helped create the welfare state. So we've had a change before in attitudes from when the rich and the elite really just thought they were the best and everybody else should do what they say, to them actually seeing that there were problems. They were helped in a way with things like the Russian Revolution though, because that kind of scared people at the top. And if you like, one problem today is we don't have that kind of scare anymore. People at the top really think that there is absolutely no alternative to what we're currently doing. There is only one plan A. This is a graph about changing rates of inequality in Britain. It's showing you in the white line the top 1% of the 1%, the richest 1 in 10,000 people in Britain, and how much more they got a year on average in income than the average person. 100 years ago they received about 400 times as much money than the average person from rent from their lands and from interest, say, on their shares. It wasn't from the amount they were being paid so much. And that was the era of Downton Abbey and the era of the big country houses and the era of servants. But you can see it coming down and coming down, and it came down in the 1920s and it came down in the 1930s. Half of the reduction we saw in inequality in the past happened before the Second World War. And there's another myth in Britain that says it takes a war to change the society, but half of our change actually occurred before that Second World War. So the aristocracy had to give their house to the National Trust, no longer had any servants and so on. We had this change in Britain, and it was a very long change all the way through to the 1970s when we became much more equal. By round about 1978, the best off 1% of people in the country, say people who are working in banking, earned on average just 6 times more than the average worker, and after they paid their tax they only earned 4 times more. So in today's money that means a banker earning £100,000 a year and an average skilled worker getting, say, £25,000 a year, rather than the 2,000 bankers we currently have who are earning over £1 million a year. And if you think, I know I'm supposed to talk about equality and we'll get on to it, but you need to get a bit angry first. People often complain about, moaning about the bankers. We have over 2,000 bankers who are paid over £1 million a year. The next highest number of bankers who are highly paid in Europe is found in Germany, and they have 197 of them, and Germany still manages to operate. Or You can look at Switzerland, and Switzerland is famous for having bankers. It's a financial centre. They pay their bankers on average half as much as we pay our bankers. Our bankers just don't like you to know that. And they have a whole series of rules and controls that allow them to do that. People get used to inequality. They get used to living in an unequal society. This quote comes from George Orwell when he turned up in Barcelona during the Spanish Civil War. And George went to Eton, fairly nice bloke in general. He was sent out to Burma, which didn't do him much good. But he got a shock in Barcelona because the revolution was occurring in Barcelona, and the shock was that the person serving him coffee looked him in the eye. And it was a shock because people hadn't looked him in the eye before when they were serving him. There'll be things about this society now that you are completely used to. You're used to celebrities having millions. You're used to having to turn the thermostat down. You're used to worrying about debt and so on. That in a different society would be seen as strange, but we're just conditioned to be used to it. And tipping's interesting. We think of tipping as normal. I don't know, tipping about 10 or 15%. If you look at the States, you need to tip about 20-25%. If you go to Greece still, you don't tip. If you go to Japan, you do not tip. If you go to other countries in between, you may give a tip, but it's smaller. The more equal country you go to in the rich world, the smaller the tips are, because you don't rely on tips if you're a waiter. I'm just trying to give you an example of the kind of things that we've come to accept, that you've only got to go to other parts of the world, let alone look at the past, to see that they're not normal. Too many words here, but the key thing is to watch how the biggest increase in jobs for young people in Britain recently has been waiting on tables, particularly in London, but the average wages of people working on tables has gone down. Once you exclude young people under 25, the biggest increase in jobs 2 years ago in Britain, 1 in all 4 new jobs in Britain was working as an estate agent. Last year, 1 in 3 of all new jobs in Britain was working as an estate agent. Working as an estate agent means putting on a suit and showing people around houses every half an hour and trying to pretend you're interested. It's not, I'm being a bit mean, but that huge boom is about a housing bubble. That graph I showed you before but turned upside down. So now we've put the aristocracy on the bottom, the white line, and we're looking at the total share of income, and the red line is the best off 1 in 10 people in the country. And way back 100 years ago, the best off 1 in 10 got about half of all income. So everybody else is left with half to share out amongst themselves, fairly unequally. And again, you can see that reduction in inequality. It might not look big, but once the best off 10th have got down to just taking 3 times, or a bit less than 3 times average income, you've got a lot more to share out amongst everybody else. It changes the nature of other people's lives. And then you can see from the late 70s onwards, and it really makes very little difference which government's in power. Everything switched in the late 70s, inequality has tended to risen. The last bit is very interesting. We've had a little dip, and then that little dip got reversed. It's not on my graph. But the most recent change is that the 1% have carried on getting richer, of which one of the key groups are landlords. 2% of people are landlords. The best half of all landlords have made an absolute fortune in the last 5 years. They've increased their wealth by, I think it's over 250 billion in just 5 years. It came out in the Financial Times on January the 18th. But the top 1% are getting richer again. It's not just the bankers, it's landlords and a few other groups. In case any of you are worrying about whether you're in the top 1%, if you've got a household income, you and your partner, of 160,000 a year, and you've got no kids, you're in the 1%. If you've got some kids, you need a bit more than 160,000. If you're on your own, 100k will do. But that's what the 1% is. Or it isn't. That's what you need to get into the 1%. But within the 1%, there is more inequality than there is in the other 99% of society. So people on London in households of 160,000 a year feel poor. They really do feel poor, because 160,000 a year will get you a mortgage, I don't know, 400,000. That'll let you buy a house in Barking and Dagenham with 3 beds, maybe 4. But for half of London, you won't be able to get a 3-bed house. Kensington and Chelsea is now $1 million for the entire borough. Westminster's gone. So if you're trying to understand how the 1% behave, you've got to begin to see things from their point of view. This is a graph for the USA, and it's similar. The most remarkable things happened recently. In the USA, the top 1% take 20% of all income, leaving just 80% to the rest. But the important thing about the USA is that they gained almost all their equality during the Second World War. And that's where that myth for us about it takes a war come from. It took a war in the States, but it didn't take a war for us. We actually began it earlier. And they've reached a much higher level of inequality than we have. And you may have heard under Obama, and this is Obama trying to achieve this, saying it's his #1 priority. Under Obama, the vast majority of any increases in income that occurred since he's been president have gone to the 1%. He's finally put taxes up. This is a similar one of these graphs. I warned you there are going to be quite a few graphs. But it isn't general knowledge that this kind of thing occurred. That there was about 70 years in our recent history where in all the rich countries of the world people became more equal. And you got these kind of things. This was a cartoon that appeared in the Daily Mail in 1942, celebrating the introduction of social security and welfare benefits. That's how different the world was by that time. Everything about your society changes in a period where you're more equal. When you have growing income inequality, and we've had growing income inequality since the late 1970s, with a lag of about 10 or 20 years, you begin to get growing wealth inequality. Because people at the bottom, with incomes that are low or falling, are not going to save any money. People at the top, with incomes that are rising, can't spend it all. Or if they do manage to buy that house in Kensington and Chelsea, you can guess where the biggest house inflation's been in the country. It's Kensington and Chelsea. So their money, their savings have made more money. So we now have spiralling wealth inequality going on. And this is causing a housing crisis. 1 in 4 children in Britain are now living in private rented houses with a private landlord in charge. That's shot up in the last 5 or 6 years. Many people consider they're only going to be able to rent. Many people who get a mortgage fail to be paid a mortgage. They take out another mortgage, don't actually get the house. And underlying these reasons are the income inequality and the wealth inequality that's rising. There's your figures. I exaggerated. It's 5 billion short of 250 billion for the landlords. I think this is the major news story of this year. This is a time of growing austerity where the country is getting poorer. But one group, and they did it simply by buying houses. You get the rent from the tenants, you charge more rent than you actually need, you save up the money, you buy another house, another house, another house. So there's many areas of the south, and they'll be in the posher parts of Birmingham, where landlords are outbidding people trying to buy houses, and then making money out of more and more people who they're charging rent so they can buy another property and another property. We're heading back in time towards the time of my granddad's youth, when 90% of people lived in private rented housing. I don't think this is a great conspiracy. You can question me later about it, but I really don't think the landlords all got together in 2008 and 2009 with the government and said, let's do this. And they have curtailed various government schemes that have helped them do it. But the speed of change. The second thing is average mortgage holders getting poorer. Part of that is house prices going down in many parts of the country, where landlords don't want to buy houses. The other part of that is people taking out bigger and bigger loans because they can't save up money on deposits. This just gives you a flavour of the slides I'm going to go through very quickly now, because I really do want to finish on time. So I'm going to show you some of these things. So when I get onto dukes and cabbages and kings, at least you know I'm heading towards the end. So it won't happen. Different countries. This is a complicated measure of inequality called the Gini coefficient. This is a simple measure, which is just how much do the top 1% get. There's the USA, made big because it's got a lot of people. Here we are next to the USA. Here are the normal countries, and here are the Scandinavian ones that are a bit abnormal. You tend to think of your country as normal, but we're not normal. We are the weird country in Western Europe. We have half the credit card debt of Western Europe, just in this country. We have more people in prison per head than anywhere else in Western Europe. We are like the USA, which of course has more people in prison per head than anywhere else in the world. For a few years Rwanda beat it, after they put all the war criminals in prison in Rwanda, but that stopped. We are strange. That's what I'm trying to say, and we should do something about our strangeness. They're also strange down here, has to be said. Okay, life expectancy. I'm missing Japan from this one, but this is showing you the kind of rough relationship between life expectancy and income inequality. And there are many reasons for this. One of my favourite ones is that in unequal countries it's quite hard to get doctors to live and work in poor areas, because doctors tend to come from posh backgrounds. But there's a problem. If doctors do anything of any use whatsoever, you really do need them to be in areas where people are most likely to be ill. In a much more equal country and in more equal cities, it's easy to spread your doctors and your other healthcare people out. But there are other things other than that. Giving more money to people who have less money has a much more beneficial effect in many ways. It means they can buy some food they really need. Give me some more money and you can see the effect on me. You don't need to give me more money, it's not going to make me healthier. And the last one of these graphs, this comes from the work of Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. Here we've got inequality going up, so there's the USA, and this is the best data from the WHO on the proportion of people suffering from a mental illness in society, usually anxiety or depression. And again you can see that kind of relationship is there, because it stresses you. You should be anxious or depressed in an unequal society, particularly one that's becoming more unequal, because no matter where you are, the people above you are zooming away from you, and the people below you are also zooming away. So if you fail, if you drop down, what you're looking at is looking increasingly unpalatable to you in a society that's pulling apart. In a society where the income differences are much more narrow, say Norway, you don't have to worry so much if you're not so much of a success, because the financial implications won't be so bad. You don't have to worry about the rich because they don't actually have that much. They're not buying all the land, so you can't live anywhere. You don't have to worry about what your kids are going to do. Your child who doesn't do too well at school will still have a good life, which is the difference from England. Prozac. This is areas that like to take Prozac will take it more in the South Welsh valleys, but basically outside of London. And here, this one got nearer to me. This is estates on which inheritance tax is paid. The areas which are grey, which I think include Hull is the largest, are where in a year nobody who died paid inheritance tax because they didn't have enough money to pay it. But this is the richest part of the country. And the two maps kind of mirror each other in a way. 1 in 10 people in Scotland are now taking antidepressants on the NHS at any one time. Iceland managed to beat Scotland in the years just after the financial crash in Iceland, but it took the idea that your country was becoming entirely bankrupt to get the Icelanders in a worse situation than the Scots were in. And the country which takes more antidepressants than Scotland or than Iceland is the USA. Different countries have done different things. Here's our 1%, the little black dots, had a lot of money but became more equal, then we became more unequal. And this is France. All these countries do this, but when they had a decision in the 1970s, they went this way, and they controlled their 1%, largely. They complain endlessly about this going on, the slight increase, but it's very different. It's not easy becoming more equal. The easiest way to become more equal is to lose a war, and lose a war quite devastatingly, because what an invading force does when it comes into your country after you've lost a war is it destroys the elite so that they can't take over again. The best example of this in world history is the Americans. Japan used to be a very unequal aristocratic country that became a fascist country. When the Americans invaded, they took the land off all the people who owned land and they handed it out equally. The Americans weren't trying to create a natural experiment in what happens if you create a very equal country. The Americans were extremely scared that there was going to be a revolution in Japan because of what had happened to Japanese society. But what they got is a society that kept controlling its 1% largely, and now has a 90% middle class, has the lowest rate of homelessness in the rich world, 100 times lower per person than the States, but very visible in Japan. You do see it because the homeless have blue tents to make them really visible, but 100 times lower, and the highest life expectancy in the world. Back here, Japan had one of the lowest life expectancies of the rich world. It's not some physical thing about the Japanese or their diet or something else. It's the society that was created in Japan as an effect of what the Americans did. And sadly the Americans don't shout about it very much. A similar thing happened in Germany. That's the inequality increasing before Hitler. We went in. If you want to stop a capital city becoming as dominating as London, you put a wall along it, which is why Berlin's a fairly equal city now. We had martial aid money to Germany, but we also deprived it of monies, and so now there's no dominant city in Germany, and that's the inequality trend in Germany. Lowest rate of unemployment in Europe at the moment, most successful economy. Here's the Dukes, in case you're wondering. The reason to put up the Dukes, although I'd love somebody to do research on Dukes, they're dying out. They are absolutely useless at producing little Dukes. Their numbers have halved in the last 100 years. It's quite hard. The point of showing this is that one reason Britain's like it is because it hasn't been invaded, hasn't had a revolution for such a long time. It's not necessarily our fault, and you don't really want to wish on anybody what happens when that does happen to your country, but that's one of the reasons why. And often these families and others are related to the same families that William gave land to when he arrived 1,000 years ago. America's in a similar situation. No successful invasion for a very long time, and also being the world power. It's easier to have high inequality when you're one of the richest countries on the earth because you've got enough money so that the 1% can have so much and at least other people can eat. Two very different countries. They often tell you there's no alternative. We're all in a global race, we just have to go this way, it's inevitable, you need greater inequality to get more competition. If the 1% get richer, that's going to benefit everybody else, and it's happening everywhere, so stop complaining. This is Bill Gates' kind of argument of, you know, the alternative is North Korea. The ridiculous thing about Bill Gates saying this in Davos is he was sitting in the place that has reduced the wealth of its 1% down steadily over time. So in Switzerland and in the Netherlands, these aren't Sweden or Iceland or Norway. They have managed to control somehow the very rich, so that the very rich do not take anywhere near as much as they take in this country, and take less than their parents and less than their grandparents. The Dutch boss of Royal Dutch Shell, must be about 10 years ago, said if you paid me twice as much I wouldn't work any harder, and if you paid me half as much I wouldn't notice the difference. Not a single business leader in Britain ever says anything like that. We do things like sack Bob Diamond. We do things now like halve the salary of the man who runs the BBC. There's lots of things, if you want to be positive, that are quietly changing. But as yet, no member of the CEOs of the FTSE 100 has just come up and said anything as obvious as that. This is a quote from Patrick Dunleavy, who's a political scientist, done way back when student loans came in, and I'd just like to put it up. Patrick Dunleavy is hardly a particularly radical social scientist, but it's just about the way you could get the loans coming into this country and not into others. The highest student loans in the world are in the United States, the next highest are in our country. What happens in much of the rest of Europe? You still have higher education that is often largely free, or you pay a tiny amount of money. That's all connected. Got you some graphs on cuts. This data comes from the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund are not a radical organisation who are trying to promote world revolution. Right? The International Monetary Fund are, if you like, the kind of bankers' organisation of the world. And this is showing actual public expenditure in this country as a proportion of GDP. So under New Labour it was around about 40%, and then it shoots up with the banking bailout. That's the money you needed to stop the banks completely folding. And then you've got George Osborne's plans to reduce it, which he's managing to stick largely to at the moment. It's the amount of GDP we spend on our society. It's roughly equivalent to the amount we tax. So you're familiar with that kind of pattern. You get told that this is what's happened everywhere, and the dot to keep your eye on is the very last dot about where we are heading. This is the United States. United States, traditionally an even lower taxing country, even lower public expenditure. You have to take responsibility for yourself, so they don't have a national health service, so it's cheaper from the government's point of view to run the United States. But if you look at the end, the United States is about to cross over. It's about to spend more money on public services than we are. That's where we're choosing to head. Let's put in Greece. Complete basket case of Greece. Okay, the Greeks were paying a bit more before, 45% on public sector, but as you'll see that wasn't enormous. Again, they had to spend a lot of money on the bailout. Everybody has to spend a lot of money on the bailout, but their cuts are not as big as our cuts, and that's Greece. Sticking in Germany and Slovenia for some reason, I'm not sure why, but the point is that our dot's still at the bottom. Let's put in Spain. Ireland. We don't like talking about Ireland in Britain and what's happened in Ireland, because in Ireland house prices have halved. So that's the most remarkable bailout that's occurred. They guaranteed the entire bank deposits of every bank, and it's really near to home. That's part of the reason we don't talk about it. But they're still planning, even after all the cuts in Ireland, to spend more government money on public services than we are. And you can begin to see where it's going now. We just stay at the bottom. I'm not sure, I can't see from here if we've got Denmark up yet. Has Denmark appeared yet? No, you can guess where Denmark's. Have we got it now? No, slow, loads more countries. Finally! Finally, there they are. Now, look at that range. Okay? Some countries spending 55% of their GDP, essentially taxing at around that kind of rate. Other countries, Ireland had the lowest taxes to kind of get Amazon and other people to come and base themselves there. There's a really wide variety. You don't all have to do the same thing, and they're all not coming out of this the same way. This is the league table of international inequality for the 25 richest countries. Singapore is a very interesting little country that's the most unequal, then the USA. Portugal no longer is in that position, so we're now gone up to third. We're more unequal than Israel. And the most equal countries: Germany, Sweden, Norway, Finland and Japan. And Japan's the most interesting of the most equal countries. Same thing, just shown another way. I've got to zoom through, or I will not end on time for you. But essentially, this is how much more money the best off 10% get than the worst off 10%. The effect is, to visualise it, when you see somebody cleaning a train in Japan, the cleaner on the train is getting paid twice as much as somebody cleaning a train in Britain. The result, I think it's fairly direct, is that they clean trains really well and really quickly in Japan and take pride in being a cleaner of a train, because you need clean trains, whereas I'm not sure how many people take pride in being a cleaner of a train in the UK. I haven't said anything about poor countries yet. This is the only data we had on poor countries, and it lines up far too well, but just to give you an idea you still get this relationship in poor countries between life expectancy and inequality. And this one here is an environmental graph, because more equal countries, people waste less because they buy less. Even though they've got the money, they don't feel the need to buy things they don't need so much because other people aren't buying it. One way in which we estimate waste is by looking at how much is thrown away, and the USA throws away far more than Japan. There is a lot of variability, has to be said in this. Right, finally, and you did want more inequality, and I'm going to give you things that are good about equality to end on. There's a great history of equality being seen as good. I argue in that little book that you can look at world religions, and in many ways most world religions began at a time or in a place of inequality, and were began partly in resistance to that inequality, to what was going on, to saying that people were worth something, that everybody had an intrinsic right and so on. I claim at the bottom that I think Marxism is a religion of the SWP as well, which they get a bit annoyed about, but this is a very long run thing. Human beings have constantly fought for equality, often won it, and then very often also lost it again. You have to fight for it and win it again. There's a myth that people are more entrepreneurial and creative in unequal countries, and it appears to be a myth when you try to actually measure these things. My favourite example is how Leonardo da Vinci, who was the son of a peasant girl, was sponsored by a rich man, but the arguments about Leonardo was he was treated as an equal. It's no good just being sponsored if they don't also treat you equally. In this country, what's your chance of becoming a successful artist? Well, unless your parents can afford to pay for your flat in London so you can be in the right place to do that, you really haven't got much chance. Some better evidence comes from scientific papers. The highest proportion of scientific papers produced per head are in Sweden and Finland. The highest proportion of patents taken out per head on inventions is not the USA, it's Japan. But the nicest evidence comes, I think I've got it here, from Italian football leagues. Football leagues are really interesting because you have the salaries of the players is public, so they know each other's salaries. And two economists, one based in Harvard I think, in a business school, managed to look at the results in one season's play in the Italian football league, and found that those teams who had a star player who was paid much more than the other players did worse on average than those teams that had players who were paid more equally. And the effects of having a single star player, people weren't passing to each other as much. They may not have known it, but they just weren't. The effects in their regression model were the same as playing away from home every match, of having that inequality. And there are lots and lots of studies now of this. Things go wrong in the structure of your society when you become more unequal. It becomes more violent and more dangerous. We've now had research that shows that over 100 years the number of riots and major unrests you get goes up. It just isn't a happy place to live in. So you end up with walled estates and people being afraid, and people driving around in cars because they don't want to go on the pavements because they're worried about who they're next to and who they're near. Many countries in the world are actually seeing equality growing at the moment. We tend to concentrate on where equality is falling, but in many countries it's growing. And it's also growing worldwide, and although I've been very late in saying it, we're going through one of the world's most amazing transformations in equality at the moment, which is the changing position of women from being subhuman 100 years ago to becoming halfway towards being seen as equals. If you want to see a transformation in the world, the changing political position of women I think is the biggest transformation that's going on, and has all kinds of effects, including, this is now 2 years ago because I made these slides a year ago, the biggest ever drop in infant mortality occurring in 1 year in the world. There are lots of good news stories out there, but how do we get less infant mortality? How do we get fewer babies dying? It's mainly women getting into a position where they can say if they don't want to have another baby, and also getting enough education to become more powerful as well. if you remember that curve of we were very unequal, we became more equal, and then we became very unequal again, it very closely matches that period when we had full employment, from the 1940s through until the late 1970s. We didn't have full employment because we were actually spending more on our wage bill. All that happened, this is putting it fairly crudely, is that the top 10% of society, as their incomes went up and up, took the wages that used to be paid to people at the bottom of society who used to be in a job. So the wage bill carries on being just as much. If you're paying the top 1% enormous salaries, if you're paying those bankers £1 million a year, you have to have fewer cashiers in your bank, paid less. So they get ATMs, and they're shutting down branches again. If you want full employment, if you don't want 1 million young people unemployed, the source of the money is there. It's simply in the salaries of the people at the top. If you slowly reduce the inequalities, which we did in the 1920s and 1930s, people at the top stop asking for more money. A great way to stop them asking for more money is to have very high taxes. There's no point asking because you're not going to get the money even if you get the salary. And when your firm makes more money, you can hire more people. If when your firm makes more money you've got to give more money to the people at the top, you don't have enough money left to hire more people. Or a much more simple thing. There's loads of everyday practices. I like to think that the people who left didn't leave because I was too boring, but because they might have had to got to somewhere for 3:10 this afternoon. And quite a few of you will have somebody who is going somewhere at 3:10 this afternoon because you can't go to there at 3:10 this afternoon. There is an army of people who take children to school in the morning, almost all female, and who go and pick up children from school in the afternoon. One reason they do it is they're very afraid of cars. That's the major threat. But also, more and more children are no longer going to the nearest school. Because in a more unequal society, and this city is very good for that, if you think about the schooling in this city, how many kids are crisscrossing to go to different schools, you end up with longer and longer school commutes. It's more dangerous, so you don't let a 10-year-old, then you don't let an 11-year-old, and I bet you there's places where they don't even let 12-year-olds go to school on their own. And we don't think of the school run as a form of imprisonment. But if you go to Japan, the kids go on their own to school. They go in little crocodiles, and they often have men, because it's still a fairly sexist society, but men with lollipops letting them over the road, because the man with the lollipop is paid enough money to live as a wage, as a breadwinner, because they value the lives of children on roads. This may seem strange to you. Just one more on roads to give you, but just to show you the difference. In parts of Switzerland, not all of Switzerland, if a child wants to cross the road, child stands up to the edge of the road, car comes, if you see a child at the edge of the road, you stop. Nothing happens. You stop in the car, child stands there. You wait until another car comes and stops, and then the child walks across the road. Right? What an economically inefficient idea when these people could be going on and doing business. I'm just trying to give you an idea of how things are different in countries that are more different. You have to control the 1%. There's always going to be a small number of people who are greedy. Some of the 1% may have become it by accident, but quite a lot of people in the 1% are unusually greedy, maybe even clinically unusually greedy, which is why, and there's lovely stuff coming out at the moment on seeing it as a mental illness, which is going to be very controversial. But I don't think it's up to people saying the 1% should just behave better themselves. If a society fails to control their 1%, it's almost your own fault anyway. I won't say much about violence, but violence levels are falling in general, if you want to get an idea of things to be happy about. And we need to celebrate the positives of greater equality. There is a difficulty about can you become more equal, and people often think when somebody like me talks like this, I'm talking about creating a society where everybody gets paid the same. So I should make it clear, as far as I'm concerned for this country, I'd just like us to become like the Netherlands, which is the middle country in the OECD for equality. I think anything else is, you know, if you're the bottom child in class, having an aspiration to be the middle is kind of realistic, I think, and we are near the bottom child in class when it comes to equality. I've only got about 2 or 3 more minutes, so I should zoom on. But this is talking about the relationship between voting. This is the part of the country which saw the vote increase for the Conservative Party last time, the part that was doing okay. And because we become so unequal, they couldn't get enough votes to form a government, so they had to have a coalition. Inequality affects your politics. And the very last thing to say, this is my final slide, is that the Institute for Fiscal Studies have recently released research showing that since the crash, since 2008, because in that top 10%, the take-home pay or incomes of 9 out of 10 people have actually come down, and the 1% have only moved away. 99% of us have actually become more equal now, so our levels of inequality are back to what they were, I think, just under John Major, the very end of Margaret Thatcher. 99% of us are now doing worse. Just 1% are moving away. Private schools are having to shut down and reduce their numbers. In 4 out of the last 5 years, the involvement in private schools has dropped because they haven't got enough parents who can afford to pay the fees. The 1% can only roughly produce about 1% of all children, no matter how they try. Private schools cater for 7% of children. So you're beginning to see the effects of growing inequality at the top. What I don't know, to wrap up, what I can't tell, is what does it take for people to actually say they've had enough of this and to begin to do something about it. And the pessimist in me looks at the United States, where things got much worse much earlier, and they've carried on living with it. And eventually they elected Barack Obama, but he didn't manage to do that much about it. He has raised taxes finally. And eventually they elect a new mayor in New York, but we'll see. And the kind of nightmare scenario from my point of view of Britain is that this is what we'll do in Britain. We'll go for another 10 or 20 years of this before we do something about it, which is most of your adult lives. So maybe your grandchildren will live in a nicer world if we don't make it better. The positive side of things is to begin to look for many of those little messages you already see. You no longer see bankers filling champagne and buying bottles for £10,000 in nightclubs in London, at least not publicly. The sense of difference about making money, the sense of a bit of shame about becoming incredibly greedy, has altered greatly. There's a lovely comic Australian, Clive James, who wrote a bit too early, I think in 2008 or maybe January 2009, just after the crash had occurred, that conspicuous consumption and wealth was about to go out of fashion, rather like the codpiece had. Now it hasn't quite gone out of fashion, but if you can just think back those years, there is a change of mood. And that is similar to 1929, the early 1930s, 1933, 1936 that I began with. But then they did have that war, which meant they got to know each other because they were all fighting together, and bankrupt the country. So although we didn't lose the war, we were bankrupt. And that made it much, much easier to do things like introduce the National Health Service, because what on earth else were you going to do when we didn't have any money? Now at the moment, kind of hopefully we're not heading for a bankrupt. We are in a mood that says we don't want to put up with this. We do trust bankers now lower than politicians and journalists. But still lots of university students want to become bankers. They just don't tell their friends so much, they just quietly apply. Because what else can you do? So I have no idea where we're heading. From my point of view, I can see a better world going in one way, but there are a lot of forces moving against it. Please think of some questions and please tell me where I'm going wrong. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We've got about 10 minutes or so if there are any questions. So, hands, and just anybody want to ask the first question? Kai.
Thanks. I guess my question is there room to be optimistic? Because it doesn't seem like the political class, left, so-called left and right, really want to address this. It seems like we're kind of going for more cuts, more austerity, and it doesn't seem to be being addressed. Is there room to be optimistic or pessimistic?
I think you need a mixture of the two. If you don't have any optimism, you wouldn't bother. But if you weren't pessimistic or angry, you also wouldn't bother. So essentially you need to think you're not going to get there, but you need to have some optimism. The best example I can give you for this is I did a talk in Oslo, and I made a mistake of beginning my talk by saying, congratulations, you have the lowest child poverty rate in the world. And 3 people shouted, it's too high, in perfect English, which is why they have the lowest child poverty, because they're angry. Currently the Conservative Party wants to bring the top tax rate down to 40, Liberals want to keep it at 45, and Labour want it at 50. So that's the difference between them, it's 5% each. But the parties were in a way similar before, and they all moved together. There was a period in the 50s when the Conservative and Labour parties vied to see who could build more council houses each year. So I wouldn't worry too much about the differences between the parties. It's what can be done to move all the parties in a particular direction, and that's when you get real change. None of the parties are now anti-gay, for instance. You know, big social changes that occur to all of them, but the differences between them are pretty minuscule.
Okay, thank you. Next.
Come on, we know your names.
Yes. Mark.
I mean, obviously, your message is about informing people of reality of inequality, but where do you feel we need to make that a reality, to challenge that? Is that through social movements? I mean, do you have any views on that?
I've got a bland answer which says almost doing anything is better than doing nothing. And it's not just little things like writing letters. Having arguments with your relatives at Christmas has a effect. The favourite argument I heard of mine was a top banker's son. He was on the board of a bank, and his son stopped talking to him at Christmas because he saw him as part of the problem. And you know, you've achieved all this in your life, he had the suit and everything else, but your grown-up son stops talking to you. And I only know about this because he started holding meetings of people in London on this big board table about inequality, because he wanted his son to talk to him next Christmas. And that's okay, we haven't all got bankers as fathers, but we've all got relatives who are a bit bigoted in one way or another, at least more than us, no matter how bigoted we are. Unless any of you are the most bigoted member of your family, in which case you probably don't know it. So those little things matter, bigger things matter. The strongest correlation, but I think I showed you enough graphs, is the change in the top rate of tax. Countries which have kept their top rate of tax high, like Switzerland and so on, the 1% haven't gained more. The 2 countries which have cut the top rate of tax the most in the last 40 years are the UK and the USA. And they peddle this lie that says that, oh, the rich wouldn't work hard. Those bankers wouldn't work hard for us if they couldn't get this money, if we taxed them more, as if they'd done a really good job. So you do need high taxes at the top, not to actually raise any money. There's no need for it to raise money. It helps people at the top not ask for more pay, because even they can begin to work out they're not going to get that much.
Steve. Steve.
Yeah, I was just interested when you were talking about countries that were more equal, whether you got a sense that there were any structural similarities in terms of like public provisions, healthcare, education, that was sort of symptomatic of that equality, and vice versa as well in countries that were.
Okay. There are some varieties. I mean, the lovely thing about having Japan there is it does then make a big difference between them. But the education system's a classic. But most of OECD countries have hardly any private education. But if you take somewhere like Finland, it's a completely comprehensive system, 99% comprehensive. No league tables, the teachers aren't examined, you take your shoes off when you go into class, somebody's in their socks, which I'm not sure whether that matters, but I think it helps. But everybody being educated together is much more common in more equal countries. Or in Japan, the effects of this equality and becoming the most equal country is even in one of their top private schools. This is a school that's twinned with Eton, where some of the royal family go to, in Tokyo. You come out of that school with an accent which is indistinguishable from the standard Japanese accent. And I know this because I had an interpreter for one of those schools. And people ignored her because she was young and she was female, and had no idea. Now, can you imagine taking somebody from Cheltenham Ladies or from Rodine or one of these other schools and going around to estates in Britain, and your interpreter speaks with a cut glass accent and you're trying to talk to people? I mean, there's all these cultural things as well, and people aren't afraid of mixing. Whereas when you begin to split people up so they don't mix, they begin to go to greater and greater fear of it. So again, just give you one last thing in Japan. I asked my friend in Japan how he chose and where to live in the city, and he said he liked that park. And I said, how much did it cost? He said, no, it's only because I like that park. The house price differences were incredibly similar. Here we spend as much money as we can, either in our rent or our mortgage, not to live in those areas which are dangerous or where the schools aren't so good or so on. And once you start doing that, the schools get worse and the areas get more dangerous, and you have to spend more money and the thing falls apart. And you end up spending these fortunes on housing, which is money either going to landlords or going to the person who's lent you the money to try and buy that house. And these things are kind of ubiquitous. There's so many parts of society.
Dave.
Yeah, thanks. My question touches on some of those points there. You, in your presentation, referred to the IMF.
Yeah.
And it's about international or transnational differences. You didn't mention the work of the OECD.
No.
And what their role might be in policy shifts and policy making, essentially.
Yes.
And it seems to me that groups like the OECD have quite a dramatic effect, particularly in the theme that you just raised about educational outcomes,
Yes.
and specifically in relation to graduate skills, etc.,
Yeah.
for economic purpose. I wonder if you've got any comments on that at all.
Yeah, I mean, the OECD is a kind of think tank based in Paris, which is largely a kind of group of economists, and tended in the past to have fairly right-wing views about things. More competition is better, and so on. They've recently changed their views. They've produced reports on inequality starting to show it's bad, and they held a meeting last month in Paris that a friend of mine went to, who was an economist. But he said what's remarkable about this, and this is about the problem of inequality and the OECD realising that the more equal countries are more productive. The economists there hadn't heard of the major work on inequality because they're economists. Inequality is studied in sociology or in geography or in health. But economics traditionally, at least in the last half century in the world, has peddled a message that just says open competition and no constraints helps everybody. And you can't just take a subject where that's become dominant, have one mighty financial crash that shows you've got it wrong, and hope that they're all going to change their minds immediately. Because if you've been brought up and spent your life believing a particular religion, in this case the religion of the free market, you don't just change your religion when there's an almighty swap to it. You try and blame it on government. So they tried to blame the financial crash on governments. But even the OECD are now beginning to shift this, partly because these graphs are just so obvious. It's taken a lot of not looking at the data and not looking at the facts to begin to realise. And the other thing, which I think is more interesting, is that there's a lot of theory that says that markets work really well when people are more equal. It began with work on prisoners of war in it was our prisoners in German prisoner of war camps. If you were a prisoner of war, you got a box from the Red Cross, and the box contained some chocolate, it contained some other things, and not everybody likes chocolate. So what the prisoners used to do is to swap the things in their boxes, and they got a pretty satisfactory distribution. You got what you wanted, but the prisoners were all equal. They all got one box. As you begin to become more unequal, the person who's got more can just buy what they feel like having, whether they want it or not. I think the classic is buying books because they look nice on your shelf, not because you actually want to read them. And the people at the bottom who've got less just haven't got any market power. So the OECD are beginning to work out that all their belief in markets doesn't work unless consumers are of roughly equal power, and then markets become very inefficient. The last example I give you is electricity consumption. We've got some lovely maps about how much electricity people use in the country. In the richest areas, people just use electricity. In London, they're using it so much the substations are breaking, because the electricity bill means nothing to you. It's tiny compared to your mortgage. Whereas in poorer areas, people are turning off any heaters. They're turning off beyond what you would want to turn off. You're not letting a child read a book at night because you're saving money for the light. Now that's ridiculous. We should be able to have children reading a book at night, and we shouldn't have people heating homes with windows open because it's not an issue, because the bill for them is so tiny. So the market doesn't work if your consumers are too unequal, and the OECD are beginning to pick that up.
Okay.
Jane,
Jane, and then last two those then, I think.
I thought it was interesting you started with Bill Gates, which that bonkers thing he said. I work in the charity sector, and I'm just wondering whether anybody's looked at whether there's any correlation between equality and inequality and the way in which charity markets itself, promotes itself. Because it feels to me like in an unequal society, we're asked to give to charity to make us feel better and to keep people in their place. I just wondered if you've looked at that.
People have looked at charitable giving, and of course there's very high charitable giving in unequal countries, so the state has it massive, because social services relies on charity, whereas in very equal countries people don't give to charity because there's no need to. You provide everything. I've noticed a change of wording of charity, say in Britain, where charities which used to be campaigning now call themselves philanthropic, doing good, doing nice things for poor people. And the other thing you get in the States is they spend 20 times as much on charities for animals than for poor children, which is quite remarkable to get to. But you get this different language about philanthropy and looking after those people who are never going to be able to look after themselves because they don't have it in them. Two, in a more equal societal time, charities being much more proactive. I think the classic would be Oxfam starting in the 1960s, or when Kathy Came Home came out, of the woman dragging her kids around the streets. Shelter and Crisis at Christmas were both started within a year. But those more equal times, these were campaigning charities that wanted to get rid of something. Having said that, the food bank charity, the Trestle Trust, is it? Trestle Trust. They're interesting because they're getting on the edge of a campaigning in a very unequal time. So none of these things are hard and fast, but you have to be aware. Always remember, of all the celebrities in Britain, who was the one who gave the most to charity for the longest? It was Jimmy Savile. But I'll say nothing else than that.
This will be our last question.
Thank you. I have a question in the area of equality. The current government is in the process of talking about educational policy.
Yes.
And they are talking about bringing all private sectors, private education and state schools to an equal level where education is equally given.
Yes.
So giving the impression that you're bringing equality.
Yes.
Then you touched on the areas where people are shifting away into better areas because other safe areas are not really good for the children to be. And I've seen schools where children coming from all different backgrounds where high needs are not met.
Yes.
And those children are all crammed in certain schools. It's like international schools and all those where there are great needs for those children. And I'm thinking, looking at this policy coming in, if you're going to, it's a good idea to bring equality, but how is that going to happen when we've got such differences of children coming from different backgrounds, such different spectrum range of abilities and difficulties? How is that private education going to be?
How will it happen, or how?
How is that going to happen?
We are in a very, very weird situation. In that currently 25% of all the money that's spent on secondary schools in Britain goes on just 7% of children whose parents have got the money to pay. There are several OECD countries where they spend more money on the children who need the most, not that way. I happen to think that Gove is cynical because he's talking about teaching Latin in his schools. When I heard this morning, I thought if he'd been talking about teaching Chinese in all these schools, I'd have taken it more seriously than the idea of teaching Latin. But how we begin to change our education system back into one where there aren't these huge differences between areas is very tricky to do, except that you are getting this point when the top 7% of parents can no longer afford. So we've had some schools that have become academies that were private. That switches it one way. Some of the academy programme I don't think was truly awful, the early academy programme, but what's happening now isn't working. When you look at educational changes in Britain, they tend to have been slow and steady. Even the beginning of comprehensives the first was in the Isle of Wight in 1945, but it wasn't until the 70s that most became. So it'll be a slow change whatever, and one single government won't do it. But the last thing to say about it is, because I'm a geographer looking at this, I don't know why I find it interesting, but I do. If you look at a city and look at its education, many things may change over time, but the actual buildings where education takes place almost always remain the same. It's the same places that it happens in. So here, this place will have had many different names and have been financed very differently over the last 20, 30, 40 years. and the physical buildings and the structure stay the same, is the same places. So it's really, what do you do with those buildings? That's your choice. And my preference is, whatever you do, if it reduces the number of journeys that children are taking in the morning, it's probably working. So I would actually fund schools more, the fewer children they were getting, until parents begin to realise it's really worth going to that school. And I would gradually reduce the funding of the really popular schools per head, until the paranoid middle class suddenly realise, why on earth are they paying an extra £50,000 to be in the catchment area when every year the school's oversubscribed? You just drop the funding by £100 a child. But that's very much a free market ideology on my part, and I suspect angry parents wouldn't allow it to happen. But we need to get children going to the nearest school again, partly because then when you want to go and see your friends are next door, and because some of you are parents, some of you will be parents, you don't want to spend your young adulthood driving children to play dates. It's the most ridiculous and stupid thing to have emerged. Nobody ever drove me to a play date. I don't want to drive my kids to a play date. They shouldn't have to drive their children to play dates. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I don't even know what a play date is. Damn it, I wanted to say thank you, I'm sure, on behalf of everybody this afternoon. There's just a couple of things that have struck me during the course of